For the last 2 weeks, we've been in Genesis, beginning in Genesis 37 and Genesis 39. This week we are in chapters 40 and 41. Now, I timed myself out to see how long it took to read both chapters, and it takes about 10 minutes. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to do things in a little bit different way. I'm going to read portions of it, but I'm also going to tell you the whole story. But to catch us up, Joseph was thrown into a well because he was considered a tattletale and his brothers hated him. He was thrown into a well and then sold off, and eventually sold to the house of Potiphar in Egypt. He was then, because he was a man of character, he was brought up and he was put in charge of Potiphar's house. Everything was his except for Potiphar's wife and the food. Now Potiphar saw this was a man of character, a good man, and tried to seduce Joseph. Joseph ran away and she physically grabbed him, and he took his cloak and ran away. And she accused him of adultery. And he was thrown into prison, which is where we find him this morning. Now, here's a man who has no other hope except for being in prison. And I wonder if he could sing our song this morning. In his time, you make all things beautiful in his time. Lord, please show me every day as you're teaching me your way that you do just what you say in your time. Well, Joseph is put in charge of the prison, and in it are thrown Pharaoh's cupbearer and the baker. Now, a cupbearer is somebody who literally just fills the cup and gives it to Pharaoh. The baker bakes the bread and gives it to Pharaoh. And they'd been thrown into prison, and Joseph noticed that the two were feeling down, and he took the time to care. In verse 7 it says, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they say, "Well, we both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them." So Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream, and he said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches, and as soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Joseph says, "In 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you back into your position. And when you get there, remember me. Remember that I told you what this dream would mean. Because I was taken as a prisoner from my homeland, and I didn't deserve I'm in this prison because I didn't do anything. I was a man of character, but still here I am in this prison." The chief baker saw that Joseph had given the cupbearer a favorable interpretation, and he said, "Well, here's my dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread, and in the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Joseph said, "In 3 days, Pharaoh will actually kill you, hang you, and the birds will come out and eat you." Well, in 3 days it was Pharaoh's birthday, and Joseph's interpretations came to be. The cupbearer was restored, and the baker was killed. Yet the cupbearer forgot Joseph for 2 more years. And 2 years had come to pass. Pharaoh had a dream, and he was standing at the Nile, and out of the river there came 7 cows. sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. And after them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. The cows were ugly and gaunt, ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. And then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy grains. And then Pharaoh woke up. The cupbearer, as Pharaoh is trying to find somebody who will interpret his dreams, the cupbearer says in verse 9, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings." And he told Pharaoh of Joseph and how Joseph had interpreted his dream in prison. And so they cleaned up, brought Joseph out of prison. He was cleaned up, he was shaven, because he hadn't shaved for 2 years, and he was brought to Pharaoh immediately. Pharaoh says, "Will you interpret my dreams?" And Joseph says, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." And Pharaoh tells the dream again, and he says, "The fat, sleek cows come up out of the Nile." And he says, "Scrawny, very ugly, lean cows come up. And they eat the 7 good cows. And even after eating the good cows, they are still scrawny and lean." Joseph interprets this to say for Pharaoh that there will be 7 good years in Egypt. 7 years of exceptional harvests, followed by 7 very, very bad years. So I challenge you to store up for yourselves these grains so that when you are in your 7 bad years, you are prepared. In verse 33 it says, "Now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of Egypt. Take 1/5 of the harvest, or 20%, and store it up for the 7 bad years." Pharaoh asks his advisors, "Can we find anyone like this man, one who is in the Spirit of God?" And so he puts Joseph, a Hebrew, in charge of all of the things. He is put second in command to Pharaoh. And he's 30 years old. Now, if you remember back to the first story we told of Joseph, he was 17 when he was sold into slavery, which means this has been 13 years between Potiphar and prison and now in the land of Pharaoh. 13 years of sitting and waiting and wondering. Joseph is given an Egyptian name and a woman to marry. And he stores up, as it says in verse 49, stores up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea, and it was so much that he stopped keeping records because there was no way to measure it. There was so much grain, they didn't have a physical means of measuring how much grain there was. Before the famine, Joseph has 2 sons named Manasseh and Ephraim. And Manasseh is he who made me to forget. Joseph says, "I named this because I forget what has been done to me by my family." And Ephraim, he who has made me to be fruitful. And it says the 7 bad years came and went, and there was enough food for the Egyptians, and the whole world came to Egypt because they were hungry too. Here ends the reading. Now, I'm not a grain expert, but we have one in our midst. Right? I had to ask him this morning, how many heads of corn are generally on a stalk? Which for you might seem like a silly question, but for me, who didn't grow up on a farm, is a legitimate question. So I asked our local Pioneer seed man, how many heads of corn are typically on a stalk? And he said, well, if it's good corn, there's one. We're working for one really good ear of corn. There might be two, a long ear of corn and a short ear of corn, but one really good ear of corn. So if you're Pharaoh and you see a stalk of good corn with 7 ears, or a stalk of wheat with 7 heads, you'd pay attention. Right? Because that's not normal. It might have been normal in ancient times to have 7 small ears. Tim was telling me a little bit about these tiny ancient grain ears of corn that might have been little, but they are not good Pioneer seed corn. Right? They are not the kind of corn that I got from Dick and Janelle Varney, the sweet corn that is good and wonderful that melts in your mouth. It's tough corn. And here's Pharaoh getting this dream. And he's looking for people to interpret it. So the cupbearer calls Joseph. Now, Joseph is a Hebrew. He's a man of different color, different nationality, different God. Why would he be worth interpreting Pharaoh, the king of the land's dreams? Well, there are 3 things I think we can learn from Joseph through the scripture. The first thing that Joseph did is he was a man of character. But he also cared for people. Right? If you are the head person in a jail, and your people are being quiet over here, you're probably a little excited that they're not causing a riot. Right? So why would the head jailer, Joseph, walk over to 2 men who looked sad and say, "What's wrong?" Joseph was a man who cared about his people. He wasn't just a man who had his position high above people, but he genuinely cared about how people were feeling. He took the time to listen to them and to listen to their dreams. And he gave them an answer. Now, it may not have been an answer that the baker really wanted to hear, right? Nobody wants to hear that they're going to die in 3 days. But he was a man that genuinely cared about people. For you and me, your positions of work, your positions of family, your positions of wherever we are raised up in higher position than somebody else, do we care about the people underneath us? Good godly character cares for the people that we think that are less than us. Now, Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him. But even in that, it was 2 more years before he was remembered. 2 more years. I don't know. I will sing of your mercy, the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing. In his time, he makes all things beautiful in his time. Joseph even said, Lord, my life to you I bring. May each song I have to sing be to you a lovely thing in your time. 2 more years of faithfully serving in the prison. 2 more years, 13 years of being forgotten by his parents, by his brothers. He gets an opportunity to talk to Pharaoh, who genuinely listens to a man that is above him as well. To Pharaoh, what is your dream? I cannot interpret it, but I'll listen to you. That was the second thing about Joseph, is he never assumed his power was greater than that of God. So he cared for people, but he always put God first. In chapter 40, verse 8, when he's listening to the dreams of those in the prison, he says, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. He relies on God to tell him of these things. And then the second part, with Pharaoh, he says again, I cannot answer your dreams for you, but God can. So let me tell you about this. Rely on God alone. There's a couple songs that are on the radio right now. One of them is called Even If. And it says, even if you don't, my hope is in you alone. It reminds me of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they're being thrown into the furnace after offending the king, King Nebuchadnezzar. They said, even our God is able to save us, and even if he doesn't, he is still God. Last week I asked Jane why she was leaking. It's her way of saying, when she's crying, she says, I'm leaking. So she played last week, and after church she was, I think you leaked like 3 times last week, at different times. And I asked her what was wrong, and she said, I played the song, He is Able. Stop it. She's leaking again, and it's making me leak. And He is Able is the song that she sang to Sam when when Sam was showering a year ago. When even if we don't know if God is going to heal Sam from aplastic anemia, if we don't know that our friends are going to be healed from cancer, God is still God and He is still able. Joseph, this man of character, is thrown into a prison in a country that's foreign to him, accused of adultery, of sleeping with Potiphar's wife. And he still relies on God to interpret the dreams. People of character care for people and they rely on God alone instead of their own personal strengths. And the third thing is that Joseph never assumed that he was the important one. Because Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and he never said, hey, pick me. I interpreted your dream, and now make me second in command. Right? He didn't hold this dream interpretation hostage to say, well, when you raise me to power, he just interpreted the dream and assumed he'd be thrown back into prison. People of character never assume their importance is more than any other person. But Pharaoh says, can we find anyone like this man one who is in the Spirit of God. People of character let their actions and their words speak for themselves. Paul talks about in many of his letters how he was a man who was the Jew among Jews. He was educated. He was the person that knew. He was there when Jesus was crucified. He was there when Stephen was stoned. And yet he was considered to be least among those around him. He was the sinner of all sinners. He understood that being a person of character, being a person of God, and a man that follows after God, that he is worth nothing. And that's a challenge for you and me as we call ourselves followers of Christ. Are we men and women of character? Are we men and women that realize that I am nothing? But I care for people. Genuinely ask how they're doing. I rely on God alone. And I never assume that I am the important one. Everybody else is ahead of me. That would be my challenge for you this week. In what areas of character do you find yourself lacking? And make a little bit of a change. If you see somebody, if you notice somebody who's down, how are you genuinely doing? No, really, not just fine, I'm great, whatever. No, how are you really doing? I can see it on your face. You find yourself saying, well, I can do this. I'm great at this. Well, my pride might be my downfall. How do I rely on God to do things greater than I can do it? And if I find myself assuming that I'm the important one, that I'm the best, then maybe I need to look around and find somebody who is even better than I am. Never assuming that I'm the best. Men and women of character, care for people, rely on God alone, and never assume that they are of great importance. So that's my hope for you, that you would find ways to be men and women of character, that your actions would speak louder than your words. So let us pray. God, we thank you that you don't leave us in our arrogance, in our pride, or alone in our weaknesses. God, even when things are tough around us, even when things are feeling like they're the worst thing in the world, you are able and you are still God, even if. God, help us to rely on you in those times. Help us to follow after you and be men and women of character. Through your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. As I thought about this, I kept coming back to the Lord is my shepherd, there's nothing I shall want. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall not fear evil. And so I think about that and about the story of Joseph, and I thought this might be a good closing hymn. So we're going to sing "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," which is number 50. Please stand.